atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. And today I'm joined both by Justin Holmes, a professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa, but also by Mike Baranowski, a professor of political science. Gentlemen, welcome to The Politics Guys.
It's good to be here.
It's fun to do a three-person show. You know, I get to...
I haven't done one of these in a long time.
I feel like what's going to happen is you all are going to fight, and I'm going to end up being like the referee. That's what I think's going to... That's my guess. Just so listeners, that's my prediction right now. We're going to find out if Ref Trey is correct. But before we get into any of that, we've got a new supporter, Mike. So why don't you introduce us?
Yes, we'd like to thank Colin, who's a new yearly supporter on Patreon. And of course, if you're a yearly supporter, that means you're making a smart financial move because you save 10% over monthly support. So, Colin, thank you very much. And one more thing, Trey, before we begin, I just want to let folks know about another podcast I think you might like. You know, red and blue states, they sometimes seem so far apart. Well, they might as well be different countries like post-World War II East and West Germany. And if you feel that way too, you should check out the Signal Award-winning podcast, The Future of Our Former Democracy, from our friends at More Equitable Democracy. It's back for a brand new season. The show's examining what the U.S. can learn from Germany's political history, including how the aftermath of Nazi Germany shaped a more resilient democratic system and what that might mean for America's current challenges. Co-hosted by Heather Villanueva and Colin Cole, the podcast blends sound-rich history and contemporary analysis to explore how lessons from Nazi Germany shaped a resilient political system and what America's current democratic challenges expose. You can follow The Future of Our Former Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. Okay, so for our stories, though, for the show today, we were going to start... Well, I don't know. Are we ever going to stop having updates on Iran, gentlemen? I feel like...
We just keep on winning. I mean, so much to talk about.
We've won this war like 18 times now.
Yeah,
18 times, I mean, and we've gotten rid of nuclear weapons there more times than I can count.
Actually, we might have won it again since lunch, but yeah.
Friendly regime, control of the strait. Yeah, I think it's all good. We could just...
We're just missing maybe they could reuse that banner from back in the Iraqi days,
that thing
right?
out of storage, right?
It's probably in storage
Call the
somewhere.
National Archives. It's got to be there somewhere.
Well, you know, funny, we didn't take that on, but they actually reduced the rules for holding on to paperwork for the president. So they could have dumped that recently. I don't know. Maybe they were holding on to it, but now it's gone. Well, I guess not. Let's get into things. Okay, so we've got a lot of whiplash coming into this story, so I'm going to just try to bring up to speed a teeny bit. This week, just as we were getting into the weekend, just hours after President Trump had announced we were going to have an indefinitely extend to the ceasefire to allow for more talks with Iran, but then the United States also promised to maintain its blockade of Iran until Iran makes a deal, and it wasn't really clear what was going to happen on that front, but that is becoming more clear as we get here on Friday. Right now, the Iranian military has fired on 3 ships. It successfully seized 2 more. Meanwhile, the United States has also boarded a couple of ships as of Friday. And there's been a variety of small level boats coming out of Iran to potentially do what appears to be some additional mining. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, Secretary Scott Bentsen announced a 30-day extension of sanctions relief for Russia for its seaborne oil, which I think really went under the radar with all of the other things going on. And that is in response to many countries facing oil shortages as a result of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So it's been a busy week and things are in flux. And you were teasing a second ago, Justin, but you're right. As we're talking, I'm sure more things will be going down. So why don't we start with you, Justin? What are your takes on what's happening? We've had peace, maybe not peace, a blockade, both sides claiming a blockade, and now whatever we're having happen at the moment.
Yeah. Oh, punt to me first for whatever's happening at the moment. But yeah, a couple thoughts I have. I mean, it looks like we're sending a delegation back to negotiate again. And, one of the things that's sort of striking to me is that it's Kushner and Witkoff, rather than Rubio and J.D. Vance this time.
Well, Ken and I mentioned that last week that perhaps that was a purposeful purposeful failure for Vance.
Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of who's in, who's out, sort of thing. But, this is one of those things that does not fill me with a lot of confidence in some ways. I mean, these are not, traditionally you would have people with a lot of foreign policy experience. I don't know, doing foreign relations with a country that you're having hostilities but not a war with, whatever we're calling it.
That's deep state thinking, Justin. Come on.
Deep state thinking. Yeah. So instead, we get a nepotism hire and a real estate guy, to do this. I think that raises, I think, some real concerns. I mean, one, just in terms of their ability, but two, it seems like there has been some trouble getting the Iranians to the table, in some of this. And
well, can I ask you a quick question about that since you bring that up? I mean,
sure.
At this juncture, from my vantage point, it doesn't appear that there's any reason for the Iranians to want to come to the negotiating table. And I can't, every week goes by and the question keeps coming to my mind, which is, why would they want to?
Well, there's that, as well. So, I think on some level, I mean, maybe this is, gives an out or something, to them by, they can just say, hey, this is not a real delegation or what have you. But I think that's a legitimate question. I mean, there are, it seems like to my mind, I think there's a couple issues here. I mean, one is that, to the extent that we have any idea of what either side wants, they seem fairly far apart. And so, negotiating there is tricky. But on some level, I mean, this is kind of the status quo is maybe not bad for the Iranians right now. We can blockade and we can shake people down for money. And, this might be as good as it gets for them, in the moment. So I'm not sure, how they would negotiate what they'd want. I think there's also this problem of just Trump making credible commitments. I mean, given that he is, very public in his, all of his statements on this. Again, I don't know what he's saying behind the scenes, or what the whatever delegation we have is saying behind the scenes. But I think it's really hard when you're negotiating to get a credible commitment out of him, which I think would be another thing that would, limit their willingness to come to the table. If he says something, is he just going to, blow it up on Twitter the next day or Truth Social, and so I kind of agree with you. I'm not sure what incentive there is for the Iranians to come and even negotiate on this at this point, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, let's take it over to you as well, Mike. Another angle here that I've kind of noticed, it's almost a little bit like a seasonal time series analysis when we look at what happens with Iran, right? As we get to the weekend, we're willing to be a little more bellicose, but then when the markets are going to open on Mondays, things are always a little bit more pieces happen. There seems to be a little bit of that. What's your take on what's been going on with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz?
I think I largely agree with Justin on this. It seems to me that if we come away from this war of choice, this unjust war of choice, without controlling Iran's uranium, without having permanently ended their nuclear program, and without real regime change, then I think they've sort of won on this. And so I don't see why. It seems to me the negotiating stance of whoever Trump is sending is essentially, well, if you give us everything we want, we will stop bombing you. And that's not a negotiation. That's just hey, we're coming here to talk about your unconditional surrender, essentially. You can stay in power, but give us everything else. And it's just not going to happen. And so And to me, I think the Iranians understand the taco stuff just as well as we here do domestically. And Trump is, for all of his bluster, Trump is a fundamentally weak man, a fundamentally a man who is not very persistent in most things. He has the attention span of a 6-year-old on meth or something like that. And so I think the Iranians, I think Justin's right. The Iranians are in not a bad position, especially now that, they didn't start the war with control of the strait, but all of a sudden now, hey, this is a potentially useful revenue choice. And by the way, what you were saying, Trey, we're giving Russia over $100 million per day now due to the suspension of the oil sanctions. So it seems to me that even though at the beginning of this whole thing, I said, well, maybe we need to try a new plan, this seems less like a plan and just like, we'll just throw a bunch of bombs and missiles at them and hope for the best. That's not a plan. That's just nuts.
If I could jump in, I mean, one thought that I've had on this kind of throughout, although that's evolved a little bit, there's never been a clear strategy for this at all. It really just feels like I think the Trump doctrine, as far as strategy goes, and this was kind of Venezuela too, is, we'll take out your leaders until you comply, is sort of that. And to the extent there's a strategy, that seems to be is just kind of hold that menace of annihilation over your head until, you acquiesce. It seems like the Iranians are less concerned about that than perhaps, it seems like in Venezuela, like that was a palace coup in some ways as much as anything, we'll just hand him over and don't blow us up. Whereas the Iranians seem less concerned with that. But the other thought, I mean, my thought was that, this was a bad idea kind of up front, kind of for all of, Mike's ideas here is that, what we want is pretty hard, but also that, my initial thought is, we're pretty good at blowing stuff up and winning that way. But in terms of kind of securing a longer lasting peace and stability, that I didn't trust that this administration had a plan for that, blowing stuff up on some level is fairly easy, like rebuilding is hard and to do that. But I've been sort of struck by even tactically, I don't feel like we're succeeding all that much either. For as much as we've done, it doesn't seem like we've taken out anywhere near the capacity that I would have thought. I was kind of under the impression that we had sort of the military strength to, sort of bomb anyone into submission in fairly short order. And that doesn't seem to have happened here. On some level, so I think in some ways it's going even worse than I expected, because I expected there were going to be giant strategic problems, but it seems like tactically as well, like this just is not going, like I thought this part would be over quickly and it's not.
Yeah, I mean, for all the talk of we've got a blockade, the fact that we're having conversations about small Iranian boats still making it through to do things like mine does raise those kinds of tactical questions. I think a larger blunder, and I don't think you guys probably agree, I'm not sure you haven't mentioned though, is it's hard to remember, but just a few short months ago, there was some real resistance to the Iranian regime from within Iran. And not only is that evaporated, but it seems undoubtedly true that our unnecessary conflict has actually strengthened the wrong side from our point of view, from our vantage point. And so not only are we not getting anything, it seems like we have in fact lost something that had been building. Would you gentlemen agree? What do you think?
Well, I'll point out that we have destroyed the bulk of Iran's military, and that's not nothing. That's
not nothing.
The problem, I think, is that we seem to have, or the administration seems to have somehow mysteriously not anticipated that they would attempt to control the strait. And you don't need a whole lot of force to do that in that very narrow
And that seems like a
bottleneck.
profoundly obvious thing that they would do. Like that, I'm just shocked that there wasn't a contingency plan there.
Well, I mean, I know we tease about this sometimes, but I mean, could this just be an example? We all tease a little bit. I think we're all a little used to it. But Pete Hegseth is a fool. Like, I mean, like, let's be honest. We've talked about his inability to actually have any real experience. Ought we to be surprised that the guy who is in charge at the level he is, with the complete lack of anything that he has, maybe it shouldn't be as surprising, all I'm saying.
I think there's a process. Yeah, I mean, some of it's that. I mean, if you look at, his whole ethos is, we need to be really tough, no holds barred, no girls allowed, sort of thing. But another thought that I had that maybe goes beyond his competence and personality. I don't know if either of you have ever read Irving Janis's stuff on groupthink. He just, quickly, he kind of looks at decision-making processes and this reminds me some of his account of the Bay of Pigs, which I think was smarter people than are making the decisions here. But kind of his premise in looking at this is, why is it that a group of like really smart people come together and do something as monumentally stupid as the Bay of Pigs? And, his take was that there was sort of a tacit unwillingness to dissent, as part of that process. And one of the consequences, and I think this, I'm circling back around, I promise. I think the Hormuz aspect of this kind of works with that, is that one of the groupthink consequences is kind of overconfidence in success and not having contingency plans. And this feels very much like that. I think that, there's nobody in the room, even if they're willing to consider, because I don't think there is room for dissent in kind of the Trump team, more so than in the Kennedy team. I mean, there it was more of an implicit concern. And frankly, they turned it around by, making Bobby Kennedy kind of play the role later on of devil's advocate for everything. But I'm really struck. I mean, this feels a lot like that situation where, you don't come up with contingency plans because you just assume that this is so brilliant that it's going to work. So I feel like there's some of that dynamic happening too, because we've seen that in other sort of foreign policy situations.
I think that's a great point, and it ties into the point I made about Donald Trump being a weak man, because I think truly strong leaders like, say, an Abraham Lincoln with the sort of famous team of rivals approach, or even more recently, someone like Antonin Scalia, the former Supreme Court justice, who said, I always hired a liberal clerk just so I could have somebody to always be pushing back against my ideas. Those are strong people. Those are people who get it. But a weak person, a scared person, a bully, he has to surround himself with sycophants, and that's what Donald Trump does, and that's why he's not. Sometimes I think he gets things right just because he has these amazing instincts on some things, at least for public opinion. But when it comes to actual leadership and making decisions, he's basically limiting himself because of his weakness, because of his unwillingness to even consider the possibility that he could possibly be wrong about anything ever.
And that strikes me, I'm not a foreign policy person, beyond kind of some political psychology stuff, but, that strikes me as especially important in this realm because, I mean, these things are not always going to work. And, I think there's this lesson here, or the assumed lesson that, gosh, if we just, it's kind of out of Vietnam, there was sort of this one wing of interpretation of that, if we just been unleashed, if we just done more, we would have won that. And I feel like that's rearing its head again, is just that, there's not a problem that you can't brute force your way through. But on the other hand, this also feels like something where, like, again, the Strait of Hormuz is just such an obvious tactical thing. Like, why you wouldn't take that first? Like, why that wouldn't be the first stop rather than Tehran, or simultaneously. I mean, presumably we have enough capacity to do both of those things.
Well, I suppose if we have any other thoughts on that, I'll move us forward. Okay. Well, I am sure in future weeks we'll continue to be talking about this, because I don't think that we're going to have this wrapped up in a pretty bow in the next 7 days. Yeah. But in the meantime, let's move to this past Tuesday and the Senate Banking Committee, which held its hearing to consider President Trump's nomination for the chair of the Federal Reserve. That is Kevin Warsh. Warsh would replace Jerome Powell, and he told Congress that inflation is a choice and that the Fed must take responsibility for it. The committee is deadlocked 12-12 currently, because Republican Tillis is threatening to block him until the DOJ drops its probe into Jerome Powell. For those who haven't been on the details of this, the White House has been having an investigation that centers on the $2.5 to $3 billion renovation of the Federal Reserve Board building in Washington, D.C. And specifically, the DOJ has been investigating Powell for perjury and making false statements to Congress for his June 2025 testimony related to the nature of the rising costs of that project. However, Tillis has by Friday, suggested that there could be a chance for Congress to take it over for him to change. But at this point, there's been no indication that the White House would be open to that kind of shift. For those who were asking questions of Warsh, the big question is he going to be independent? Or is this part of a larger project to get the Fed to do what President Trump wants it to do? And unusually, we also know that Powell has pledged to remain on the Board of Governors until his term ends in January 2028 to help protect precisely with that independence. And so, Mike, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts on Warsh?
Well, first, just an update. Fairly recently, I think only an hour or so before we started recording, that Jeannie Pirro announced that she would be dropping the investigation into Powell and the Fed. And so
Thank you for bringing us up to speed on that.
So probably it's a done deal at this point then.
Yeah, given the fact that Tillis said in the hearing, well, let's just drop this investigation so I can support you and you can get confirmed. I think it's pretty clearly going to happen very quickly. I mean, Warsh is clearly qualified. He was a Fed governor from 2006 to 2011. So I have no question that this will sail through. Well, not sail through, because I still think there are questions, because if you parse Pirro's language, and it doesn't take that much parsing, it seems clear that she said, well, we'll drop it unless new information comes to light. And I would not be terrifically surprised if new information, I'm putting that in air quotes, comes to light right after, Warsh is approved by the Senate to be Fed chair. I could easily see that happening. Of course, there is no information. I mean, when Judge Boasberg looked at the grand jury subpoenas, he quashed them, which is a rare thing to happen, just basically said, well, there's no evidence here. And then when he asked the prosecutors, hey, come on in secret. You can show me what you have if you have anything. They said, well, actually, we can't do that. But, can't we just go ahead and do this? I mean, everyone knows exactly what is going on. Warsh would not be my pick for this job, but,
well, he is surprisingly not the craziest of the picks that have come from the Trump administration, to be sure, for his background. However, there is a lot of question if maybe he hasn't changed some of his policy positions, right? Early on, when it came to the initial financial crisis, he thought that monetary policy was being too easy. And more recently, he seems to have really kind of backed off of those positions. And I think that's one of the reasons there's been a little bit of heartburn about him, is to say, here's a traditional guy, but does he really still believe what he's always believed? Or is he making changes in response to new information? Or is he making changes in his belief because of Donald Trump? And it can be difficult to parse that out. He could be making honest saying, hey, I had some things wrong. That's fair, but it's hard to parse that.
Well, and if I could go kind of piggyback on that a little bit, there's also been some talk, he's talked a lot about independence of the Fed in the past. He's got a lot of public statements that's really important, but then has used, language like supporting Donald Trump's economic policies and things like that, more recently, which again, I think calls into question, some of that, has he had a shift on that as well? Or is that just something you need to say to get appointed, and that's hard to know. I mean, I think you could not, if you want the appointment, I think you can't not say that sort of thing. But at the same time, like, he's pivoted on that a little bit as well. I mean, he's talking more as a partisan. So.
Well, one of my favorite exchanges in the hearings was when Senator Kennedy asked him if he'll be Trump's human sock puppet. And my thinking was, well, who's going to say, oh, yes, actually, that was my plan. I'm just going to be calling up Don every day.
More of a marionette.
Seeing what he wants, I mean, and pretty clear. But I will say more substantively, I mean, he's called for regime change at the Fed, which sounds scary. And I think it's just more of kind of a rhetorical, but he does make some reasonable points. He says, let's take a look at the models that the Fed uses for inflation and make sure that they're actually capturing what we want to capture. That seems pretty important. He plans on doing a massive study on that. He makes a reasonable case that the Fed, starting really since the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, had let its balance sheet become just enormously large and really needs to kind of shrink that down. And these are reasonable positions to take. I don't know that I necessarily agree. And on the, how did he go from being a hawk on inflation when he was a Fed governor to be more of a dove? Well, his argument is that was before AI, and he thinks AI is going to boost productivity enough to essentially keep inflation down, which will allow the Fed, therefore, to lower rates without spiking inflation. Now, I'll believe that when I see it, but it's not a crazy argument, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could have a whole show just on the nature and hype of AI. But no, I think
In fact,
you're
we
right.
don't even have to do it. We can just just have Claude do it.
You'll use Claude, I'll use Gemini. We'll see which AI will win. But you do make some excellent points. And the other one that he's made that you didn't mention there in terms of not just paying it down, but changing the kinds of assets that they have purchased has also been a shift since the financial crisis that has changed some of its outcomes and goals. And I think we can get on board with that.
I think there's a concern about how.
Yeah, Justin. Yeah.
Oh, there's some concern about how you do that, though. And, if I'm going to push back a little, because, we agree on a lot, but I may push back on a couple of Mike's points, that kind of both of those things. I mean, they're within the realm of reasonable, but they also make me a little worried about who's doing them and why. We've had enough kind of tinkering under the hood with economic data, and such already that, how, I mean, I like good data, but, in terms
well, you
of,
never know. He might get RFK to figure out what a 600% price decrease is, and they can figure out how inflation works together. One mathematician to
so
another.
I mean, my concern, I have a little concern, here about, well, how are we tweaking that inflation? And I would just say the other thing, I mean, checking the balances are fine, but how you might unwind those if you're going to shrink the balance sheet a little bit. There was a move in 2019 to do some of that, and it actually caused a bit of an inflation spike, there. It's kind of forgotten in the wake of the COVID stuff. But kind of how you might unwind that stuff is, what the consequences of that are. If you come in with that as a priority, I mean, on the one hand, I think it's always worth considering what's there and what's a sensible thing to have. But, if you're coming in with this kind of regime change language, and maybe it's just language, but, are we coming in with these kind of process concerns and not being as concerned about sort of what the outcomes are? That makes me a little nervous. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, wholeheartedly, but
well, I'll say the one area
I'm a little more skeptical, perhaps, of the wisdom of some of this.
Well, one of the areas that gave me pause is, and I recognize that he's not going to say it straight up, but in his exchange with Senator Warren, his inability to just be honest about the 2020 election would be one of those examples of where you go, couldn't there have been a nice way to just say, of course, he lost, as opposed to, well, it's a politics thing. It's like, well, no, there are some things that are politics things. There's other things that are just empirical. And that was another area that gave me a little bit of pause. What about you, Mike?
I think it was an inappropriate question. Actually, I don't really see it as anything to do with his potential job as being chair of the Fed. It was clearly a gotcha question, and he clearly could not answer it in the way that I think he believed. And so I just, that's why
if you're not willing to be honest about reality, I mean, come on.
Can I split the difference between you two? I think, that issue is a litmus test for Trump, on some level. And
exactly.
I think, to Mike's point, it's really not germane to his job. I mean, he's not, so in terms of the appropriateness, this is not somebody at Justice that's, overseeing elections or something like that. I mean, on some level, do I care one way or the other what he thinks about, the 2020 election? On the other hand, if we're going back to that question of loyalty, if we're trying to ferret out, is this person a sock puppet or not? I mean, he's in a rock and a hard place. Like I'm guessing he probably doesn't believe, what Trump said, that Trump won 2020. On the other hand, I mean, I think it is sort of an interesting test here. It's maybe not so much of a gotcha in that, this, if we're trying to figure out, is this person a sock puppet or not? Well, that might get at it a little bit, in terms of where his loyalties lie. So.
The thing is the hearing it's not about anything though. It's all about just scoring the points and trying to get that viral moment. I mean,
but isn't that every hearing?
Well, yeah, but I mean, everyone knows.
I mean, they're all BS.
And that's, I guess, why I don't get too worked up, because you know what the answers are going to be almost.
Right.
It's almost a surprise if you hear anything new. Now, I will say that I'll give Trump and his people some showmanship credit here, and they deserve a lot of that, if in no other area sometimes, for the approach of let's go into hearings just being as hostile as possible. Of course, that's where people have already been confirmed, right? But so if you're actually looking for the confirmation, you just lie like hell, like everyone does before these committees. But then once you're confirmed, apparently you just call everyone in the other party just a know-nothing jackass and move on and take softballs from your party. Like, will you be Donald Trump's sock puppet? Of course I will not, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I will say I'm just broadly cynical, in kind of a small d democracy sense. Like I'm broadly cynical about hearings in general. I mean, I had a project in grad school where I got stuck reading like 10,000 pages of congressional testimony to content analyze them.
What did you do wrong?
Yes, I was thinking somebody got upset with you.
I shouldn't even let the secret out, but like flattery gets you everywhere with me, and I got sweet talked into. It's like, gosh, I think you do such good work. I'd really like you to work as my RA, and gosh, that's. So I got paid for this BS, but but I will say, this was not confirmation hearings, but I read a lot of congressional hearings, and I will say not a single one of them changed a single vote. I mean, it is a lot of grandstanding. I mean, this was all kind of environmental policy stuff, but
foreign listeners, though, isn't it worth pointing out that the idea that committees and things, even congresspersons, it goes back to Mayhew, right? We recognize that you need to have positions are more important than outcomes for the purposes of reelection, because nobody is as deeply interested in the outcomes as they are in this position takes that everybody makes. And today, you put that together with the need to have 24-hour media coverage and social media, and you've got to have moments that you can hope might penetrate into people's bubbles and then go, oh, I agree with that position.
Oh, and this stuff that I was looking at was, this was 25 years ago. So, it was kind of the 24-hour news cycle, but not like it is now. And, it was really striking. So much of this was just, I want something to be able to say if this issue ever comes up. It's like, I want a pull quote, if anybody ever gets
Well, I think one of the greatest examples of that change, I worked, a professor here, Dr. Bobby Kern, ran for a school board position, and I managed his very shoestring campaign here in Oklahoma, because we were trying to make some points for individuals who had disabilities and learning disabilities. And it was a very competitive race. Actually, the Republican Party put in some significant amounts of money to candidates, even though it's nonpartisan. You guys want to guess with one of the biggest issues that kept coming up? What was Dr. Kern's position on gun control? Well, of course, and as a matter of fact, I saw one of the candidates who were putting signs out, and she said, you guys haven't really gotten into the gun control thing. And I even asked her point blank, I was like, well, what the heck are you going to do about gun control on the Oklahoma Edmond School Board District? She's like, well, there's all kinds of things. And I thought, well, I'll be fascinating to know what those are when you get on. But I recognize
believe that
what's
school
going
board
on.
controls the meaning of the Second Amendment. And,
it does. It comes up regularly. The Supreme Court and local school boards together.
No, just
deciding,
that local school board.
Yeah, just that one.
Trey, I thought the gun control issue in Oklahoma was just basically, firm grip, both hands, that sort of thing. I don't know.
Barrel pointed in the safe
here
direction.
It's more about, can you kind of get, I won't tease too bad. Well, before we get though into our next story, Mike, I think we've got an ad.
Yeah, absolutely. Some folks probably wonder what sort of president you'd be, right? Will you be like a populist hero like Donald Trump is to some, a backroom deal maker, or maybe a pragmatist who actually gets things done? What a shock that would be. But you can find out for yourself by stepping into the Oval Office with Fantasy President. It's a deep dive political simulator where the weight of the free world is on your shoulders. No pressure. Balance over 30 stakeholder groups from Wall Street to AFL-CIO and navigate a high-stakes diplomacy system with 6 world powers. They've already got over 10,000 players building their own administrations, testing radical policies, and fighting for their legacy. And the best part is that it's an open alpha and completely free to start. Check it out at fantasypresidentcareer.com. You'll also find the link in the show notes.
This sounds like the kind of thing that's going to keep me from getting papers graded.
I looked it up. You as you were reading the ad, I'm like, I'm going to pop this up.
I know what I'm doing this weekend.
This is the best. I think this is the best sponsor we've ever had. We all went, yes, this is what we want to do now. Okay, so we gotta play with this. Okay, so there we go. But let's get back to our actual show and not just the Presidency Fantasy Simulator. So So, in a move that I think has been sending shockwaves all different kinds of ways, gentlemen, especially in the nonprofit world, the DOJ indicted the Southern Poverty Law Center in a sweeping set of federal charges. The allegations, which come via an indictment, alleges that the civil rights organization defrauded donors by secretly funneling money to extremist groups. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche said that the group was, quote, manufacturing the extremism it purports to oppose by paying sources to stoke racial hatred, end quote. The center's interim CEO, Brian Fair, said the group was simply being targeted for political reasons and explained the program to work with informants no longer exists, but that it did, in fact, save lives. The investigation originally began under the Biden administration, but officials at that point opted to not bring criminal charges. Some of the criticism comes from the center, including a section on Kirk's group, Turning Points USA, in a 2024 report on extremism. So here's the key. Feds are going to have to prove that the Southern Poverty Law Center used shell companies not just to pay informants, but to actually fuel the very hatred they claim to fight. And that's going to be hard. However, it is also possible they could bring it up on charges that they were just defrauding the bank, because some of these companies did not, in fact, exist. Either way, it would be a huge blow to the current civil rights infrastructure, but it appears a little uncertain whether it's going to be possible. So, gentlemen, what are your thoughts on this? This is a little more complicated than it might look on face value. Justin, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, mixed feelings, in a lot of ways. I will say I'm a little surprised, or maybe not, that they did get an indictment here. It goes in front of a grand jury. Admittedly, you're not putting on a defense, but, this is a little more than just, we're bringing charges without, anything else. At least this passed the lowest possible bar, in terms of getting heard. On the other hand, I think some of this is, kind of tenuous. And this is where I have my standard, I'm genetically a lawyer, but not actually a lawyer, kind of disclaimer. But it does feel like, sticking some of these charges is going to be maybe a little hard. I'm not sure what statute, and I've seen this from several legal analysts, what exact crime is there defrauding,
So there's
donors?
two potential here, right? The one is effectively wire fraud and trying to commit money laundering. And that's going to be a difficult one to prove because there's all kinds of intent behind that. The one that might be easier that is also here is the bank fraud, which only requires you to have lied. There's no kind of intent that's necessary for that. So when I first look at this, it seems more likely, again, as you note, I look at these things, I'm not a lawyer. It appears to me, and when you take a look at kind of the analysis of it, it looks like that kind of money laundering is going to be a pretty tough sell, but I don't think the bank fraud was as difficult a sell, given that they aren't disagreeing that they were using shell companies that didn't really exist.
Yeah,
and so that's a different bar there.
That's a different bar, and so I think that's a little more plausible. I do tend to have. I think, and the Blanche's press conference the other day, this really does feel pretty political to me, in terms of targeting. The SPLC, and I think they may have gone too far. In some ways, in terms of who they're calling out as, hate groups. And that was a critique from the left as well, is that there's maybe some mission creep here, and if everybody's a hate group, then is anybody a hate group, at some point, are you diluting your message and whatnot. But just the things that we're focused on, it's this, Blanche's press conference. It's all this, they're funding extremism and as if the Ku Klux Klan and American Nazi Party are just sitting around minding their business until, the SPLC comes along and makes them do a racism somehow. But it feels very culture war-y, and kind of looking at some of because I spent too much time in Facebook comments,
Well, it is fair to say that, because there is now this whole kind of movement on the right that is saying, well, look, there never would have been a Charlottesville unless it wasn't for the SPLC.
Right.
There never would have been, because they're the ones funding it so that they can then increase their funding.
Yes, and I'd go further than just Charlottesville. I mean, it's a lot of the blowback here is, well, there's no racism in America anymore. It's all manufactured. It's all a hustle. And I think, I see Mike smiling. I mean, that seems like a pretty dumb argument. But it plays, this plays with a certain audience that, the only victims of racism are white people, and any other racism is just, fundraising drive.
But at the same time, I can't completely say that there's no there when you've got shell companies like Rare Books Warehouse and the Center for Fox Photography sending out $270,000 to an individual, right?
No, I would say the SPLC, I mean, they've had problems in the past. Morris D's left over kind of sexual harassment issues and some concerns about where the money went and things like that. And they've gotten, I mean, it's a right and left set of critiques, in terms of like, are you living up to your mission? Are you spending too much time fundraising? Are your salaries, out of whack and things like that? So, I think they do have some problems. But again, a lot of this, just the way that it's talked about, and frankly, some of the other charges. I mean, I think, if it was, hey, this is money laundering, or, this is the bank fraud stuff, that's not very sexy. And, it was the press conference was very culture war-y, which, again, to me just feels like that's some of the motivation there. One other thing that kind of was pointed out, and I think the New York Times this morning, this could also be some kind of inside palace intrigue a little bit, because, Blanche is acting AG, but he is not, Attorney General yet. He's not been nominated to be Attorney General, and he's kind of a Trump outsider a little bit, or a MAGA outsider, not a Trump outsider, but a MAGA outsider in terms of his kind of political stances. And certainly this and some other things could be sort of him trying to win Trump's favor, kind of ingratiate himself with kind of others in the administration to put him, kind of ahead of, say, like Harmeet Dillon or somebody, like that might also be in the mix. So, again, this is all pretty speculative, but I don't know. I mean, some of this just feels pretty suspicious to me, even if there is some fire there.
Mike, what is your take about, especially as what Justin's saying, the difference between the press conference versus what I was reading in the details of the indictment?
Well, I guess I sort of pulled back and not really focused on the politics of it, which, like politics of almost anything on either side in the Trump era, is largely ridiculous asshats just saying things to get X hits or something like that.
I'm just glad we can say asshat on this show.
I don't know if we can, but I just did. So I guess.
Well, yeah,
I'm going to have to click a different box for this show. We've had a jackass and an asshat. I don't think it's going to be the.
I've said several questionable things over the years, so yeah, I feel a little better. I'm sorry, Mike.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think we need to pull back and think about what the government is saying, because the false statements to a federally insured bank, it seems to me that if the allegations are close to true, that they almost certainly did this, and that is more than problematic. That is, in fact, illegal. Now, the wire fraud, though, what the government is arguing here is that a nonprofit committed wire fraud by failing to tell donors about the operational details of an intelligence gathering operation against some very dangerous, potentially dangerous groups. And the point here is that if you talk to people in the nonprofit sector, they should be freaking out, because there is nothing to prevent, let's say a Democratic president from saying, you know what, that Heritage Foundation, let's look at their fundraising materials. Did they tell all of their donors exactly what that money is going to? Well, that must be wire fraud. And it doesn't matter if you can prove it or not. Right now, SPLC is probably going to be spending $2-3 million just on their legal defense. The charge, the process is the punishment, like we've seen again and again and again. And this is something that could very easily turn around on conservative or Trumpian populist causes. This is a horrible, horrible idea. And if you're anywhere close to a libertarian, you got to be tearing your hair out, assuming you have any anymore.
Well, I mean, some of us don't, but be that as
most
it may,
of us here don't.
In that vein,
challenge share group, yeah.
I'm getting there. In that
Join me, gentlemen. Sorry.
In that vein, one of the possible outcomes of this apparently would be forfeiting all of their assets, essentially. And again, for nonprofits, I mean, that's just terrifying. Like that, if you screw up, like not, it's not just a fine or, punishment for people in charge, but I mean, that would be that's a death penalty for your organization at that point.
Well, yes and no. I took a closer look at that. I mean, if you take a look at I think the one claim that's sort of the one that they're likely to win on, right? The false statements, that might end up costing them, by my estimate, and I did a little back of the envelope calculations, maybe between 5 to 20 something million. That's between like fines, court costs, forfeiture, all that sort of thing. I mean, they have like a $787 million endowment. They'll take a hit. And reputationally, that might actually help them reputationally on the left. So, but I think it's much more of a concern for smaller, less well-funded groups who now the government, if this novel legal theory has what we call crazy ideas that haven't been tried before because they're crazy ideas, well, if this is accepted by anyone, well, all of a sudden, this is a huge stick that the government can use to beat on or threaten to beat on nonprofits that it doesn't happen to like. And that should scare everyone, left or right.
Well, the problem, though, Mike, is, and let's be honest, this is something that has driven me nuts forever, and that is that MAGA doesn't think in those terms. Right? Like that idea that these things could come back around and affect anybody in the House is always left to being an impossibility.
Because we'll win forever. Yeah, of course.
We're going to win forever. We're always going to move forward. And only evil people are going to be the ones who are harmed and not us good people, because we're the ones who are now going to maintain the stick.
Gosh, if only there was a fascism discussion on this podcast a couple weeks ago.
I mean, well, you're not wrong, right?
No, I'm saying it in a slightly facetious tone, but I'm dead serious.
Well, see, I'm glad you said that because I thought you were being facetious. I won't lie.
You can sometimes can't tell with me. I don't have great tells. So.
But I will say, guys, the SPLC is sort of a weird organization, at least in my view, right? Because it's formed here, I think it was 1971, and mainly to combat the Klan in the South.
Right.
But by the 2000s or so, they really had more money than targets, and so you see them expanding their scope to like any big bureaucratic organization with multi-million-dollar budget does is when your mission shrinks, you don't say, well, I guess we should just, kind of start closing up offices and going home. You say, well, what other stuff can we do? Because we're going to use this money. We need more money. That's just how organizations think. And so they branched out into hate, or as they call it. But if you take a look, there were something like over 1,300 groups on their hate map.
Right.
None of them is left-wing. And the reason why is because there can't be, sort of by definition. I mean, they're categories. They don't have categories for anarchism. They don't have categories for something like violent, anti-capitalist, eco-terror, Antifa. They took away black nationalist in 2020. So basically, they have designed a system where hate is defined as right-wing. And if I'm someone on the right, I have some issues with that too,
Well, and on that mission
fair.
creep thing, they've gotten some critiques from the left as well. You've got all this money and you've got poverty right there in the name. Why aren't you working on that? If you're looking for other things to do, and that was kind of my thought earlier too. Is I do have some sympathy for some of these groups. I mean, I'm not sure that they really fit the definition of hate groups. That have landed on their sort of hate group list. I mean, they're groups I don't like very much in many cases, but
Yes.
I think there's a difference between being the George Lincoln Rockwell and being just a run of the mill kind of right wing political group.
Well, that's an interesting point that we could spend some time on because, right, I think today we do have this point of view that if it's not our thing, then it's a bad thing. It has to be a hate thing. It can't just be somebody's being stupid or wrong. Or, I mean, there's a lot of, I don't mean that as you were saying a second ago, I'm not facetious. There's a lot of stupid things that happen, and it's not because somebody's doing evil. It's because they're doing dumb.
Yeah. dumb
I'm trying to
law
think
or
whose
dumb and
internet law
evil.
that is, but yeah, it's never attribute to malice, which can be better
Yeah.
explained by stupidity.
Yes, I think often erroneously attributed to Napoleon, but apparently not actually him, from what I
Yeah.
understand.
Well, if you can
So-
attribute something to Napoleon, then everybody will
Yeah.
believe you, right?
But
It's just,
yeah, I will say one of the legal points, just getting back to that, SPLC's argument on the shell entities is, well, we created these so it wouldn't raise any red flags, right? Because you say, well, we're paying out the Fox photography. Well, that could be a regular business expense and so forth. But if SPLC regularly makes kind of these big purchases of prepaid cards, which is what I believe they use to pay a lot of their informants with, well, that all of a sudden looks suspicious. And okay, that makes sense as far as it goes. But the thing is, if it was just about protecting sources and informants, SPLC could have paid them as confidential contractors and just redacted their names in public filings. So they could have set up like a confidential operations budget, made that open to auditors and regulators, but shielded it from public knowledge. So it seems a little shady to me, certainly.
well,
It's kind
and
of that
again-
operator mindset, we're doing important work, and so we've got to be we're like spycraft,
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of stuff. It's almost like they're cosplaying a little bit as spies
Well,
or something.
And on
here.
that, gentlemen, we've all three been at different kinds of educational institutions. How often have we recognized administrators or others who have attempted to skirt or bust a rule because they thought that some end was going to be better than that, right? Oh, that doesn't apply to me because, well, so I can imagine that too on that front.
Of course, it's more than breaking a norm, though. It's it's
Oh,
lying
I wasn't
to a
saying norms. I mean,
federally
even here,
insured
how
banking
many times have
institution.
we tried to bend? How many times has the institution trying to bend an accreditation rule, for example? Right, that's an analogous kind of deal, right? But you're not wrong. Any other last thoughts?
Just on that front, one other school in our region system is currently some concerns about some athletic spending, in that realm. So, they were not funding confidential informants, but yeah, kind of to your point, there's there might be things that go beyond, bending rules, there. So, crossing
The
over.
bending rules is one thing, but multiple felonies is I don't
Right.
know, to
Well,
me,
and
a
that's,
little bit
somebody's
different.
actually kind of asking for an audit on those grounds, so
Yeah.
yeah, it happens.
No, I'm not. I was not trying to downplay the felony. Just to be clear, that was not the point there. But let's move into our last story, gentlemen. That's going to be the Virginia redistricting. So, the 2026 midterms are being fought over before a single vote is cast. And I can hear Ken in the back of my head every time I was preparing for this story. And the latest in a series of states changing or trying to change their districts was Virginia. And voters this week approved a new congressional map that creates a potential 10-1 advantage for Democrats. Now, this follows California voters approving Proposition 50, which empowered a commission to redraw seats, which looks to be projecting to have a plus 5-seat advantage for Democrats there. Meanwhile, Texas was allowed to keep a map that gave them a plus 5 advantage for Republicans. Florida more recently tried and failed, although this week I saw that there has been some scuttle for them to try again in the wake of Virginia. Now, Ken has argued on the show and with me, we've had some battles over this one, that Democrats need to go ahead and redistrict and therefore purposely gerrymander to combat the purposeful gerrymandering of Republicans. As a matter of fact, AOC made that point this past week. So my question for both of you is, do you see Virginia as kind of the Ken justified redistricting gerrymandering in response to the evil gerrymandering of the other side? Or is this just an excuse so that everybody can keep gerrymandering the way that they've always gerrymandered before and we all pretend like we don't want it?
The former, not the latter.
Okay, go ahead, Mike. You start us off.
I mean, pretty clearly, President Trump started this with the whole Texas thing and thought that they could pick up a bunch of seats. And now it looks like it's going to be pretty close to a wash with Republicans, though, I think being seen more as the party that's trying to rig districts than Democrats. Democrats have been very careful to use language, well, we're only doing this temporarily to combat this and that sort of thing. So I think this was a political gamble. I understand why President Trump did it, because even before he started doing some of the stuff he did, just history tells us that the odds of, the Republicans keeping the House were pretty low. And so pull out all the stops. I think it doesn't look like it's going to work. And that's what you get. You start this fight, and maybe it's like with Iran, right? You start a fight, you don't exactly know how it's going to go, but you say, well, what the hell? Let's see what happens. This is like the FOMO administration. Let's just do it all. Let's see. I don't know.
Move
what the hell? I'm a billionaire. I'm 79 years old. What do I got to lose?
For using internet acronyms, it's the FO part of the FAFO as well. Fool around and find out.
There you go. Yeah,
if you spell it with an
yeah. There's that too.
But yeah, I mean, I'm with Mike and Ken here. I mean, I am not a fan of gerrymandering by any means, and I think it is a symptom of sort of a deeper democratic rot. Small d democratic, not the party. The lack of sort of competitive districts, I think, is really a big problem. And letting people in power draw their maps, and we've got a lot of, I mean, it's a bipartisan problem, to be clear, for every Illinois, there's a Wisconsin, and so on. That said, you'd have to be a complete dumbass to, unilaterally disarm. And using my technical political science language there, you can't back down from this at that point. I mean, if we're going to kick off another round of this, you can't just roll over and say, well, on principle, I think gerrymandering's bad, so we'll just let them have it. If anything comes to this, and I don't think it will, but if this could spark some bipartisan anti-gerrymandering legislation, that would be great. Probably not going to happen.
Not going to happen. Okay.
Well, yeah, you have it until it's inconvenient, right? Because there's a constitutional amendment in Florida that says you can't do it to benefit a party, but they're trying to find a way around it. Because,
right.
I mean...
but the U.S. Supreme Court has shot down, we don't care about partisan gerrymandering. It's come up a couple times, and I think it's problematic, but again, you can't walk away from it. If one side's doing it,
but the problem
unless we find a way to de-escalate both sides from a legal standpoint.
So for listeners, one of the reasons this is a complicated issue is the Constitution allows each state's legislature to make the decisions about the federal, unless Congress overrules it. And in this case, I don't know what's going to create a bipartisan push for a lack of gerrymandering, because it would be a lot of effort to effectively get what you already have via gerrymandering, i.e., you have elections going back and forth frequently because of the distribution of states, right? And so I think all of those things are dumb. Dumb is the wrong word. I think they are dead on arrival is what I'm trying to say, because of the nature of the system. And further, you would have to effectively disenfranchise states if you wanted to get rid of gerrymandering. Well, I mean, if you want to fix what your state does, elect different state leaders. Right? I mean, that's what it boils down to. But that's never going to happen.
Well,
so
but they gerrymander the states.
Well, true, but here's the deal. No matter how you gerrymander Oklahoma is going to have a legislature that leans for Republicans widely. What are you going to do? I mean, there's no circumstance in which that's not going to be the case, and I just don't know what the practical fix.
But I guess I'm going to harp on Wisconsin.
There's a difference. I think there's a difference between like right now, the map in Virginia is 6-5 Democrats, which is pretty close to what we saw in the 2024 presidential results. Yeah. Something like 46% of voters chose Trump over Harris. So that's pretty reasonable. With this new map, it could potentially be 10-1 Democrats in a state, again, where something like 46% of the people, a little over that, voted for Donald Trump in 2024. That's messed up. Anyone who thinks that's okay in any larger sense, I don't know what you're smoking. I want some, but it's clearly.
I eat. I don't smoke. Just to be clear.
And not just that, I guess, but. I also, we don't even know if this is going to go in effect. It might. There was a Virginia judge who put a hold on it for a number of reasons, including, and I think there's something really here, misleading ballot language. And just to give folks a sense of, well, so what was in there. The question, as voters saw it, was, should the Constitution of Virginia be amended to allow the General Assembly to temporarily adopt new congressional districts to restore fairness in the upcoming elections while ensuring Virginia's standard redistricting process resumes for all future redistricting after the 2030 census? Now, you tell me what to restore fairness in the upcoming elections actually adds information-wise to that statement. No, it's for people looking at it and say, yes, I'm all for fairness in elections. I guess I'll vote for that. I think Republicans are right to point to that language and cry foul. That smells to me.
I guess my
that's
rejoinder
fair.
would be, does anybody in Virginia at this point not know what that was about, though? I mean,
But that's not a defense. Well, everyone's all partisan, so we can just lie our asses off and mislead people because everyone who's voting knows.
but is
now.
anybody being misled at this point?
Well,
I mean,
I'm gonna
there's
pause
a
though,
lot of
but
publicity around that.
You're a political psychologist. It's fair to say that I think you're expecting a lot of political knowledge of voters, and we know empirically that the political knowledge of voters hovers somewhere. I mean, this is just me.
I was
pulling
just
a
talking about
number.
it today. It's slim to none.
Yeah.
But I would also say that the people that show up for a special election that's had a lot of hype around it are going to be more informed than your average bear.
So is the rule that we can say misleading things to more informed voters because we know they're not going to be misled?
In other words, they can figure it out. They can know you're lying. They can
define
know.
fair. I mean, maybe 10-1 is fair in somebody's mind.
Well, at least in a legal sense, it's kind of hard to make that argument, right? Well, they should have known better. They should have known we were lying to them.
But is there a standard for the word fair?
I'm going to be honest. I'm glad you said that, because when you said that, Justin, all I could think of was, here is the poster child for the Democrats of the 90s. It depends on what your definition of is, right? Like, come on.
No, but this is different. I mean, you can literally take that statement out, and it actually makes the question much shorter and clearer and more comprehensible. And so you have to ask yourself, in constructing that, what was the purpose of the people who wrote that language? What does that add? Well, all it really does is it pushes people toward one side and away from another side. And in ballot language construction, that should be the ultimate no thing you shouldn't do, right? I mean, ballot language should be neutral. This is not neutral ballot language. I have a huge problem with this.
Well, even if it wasn't neutral, it should at least be descriptively honest.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Gentlemen, last thoughts on Virginia?
I think one thing that was a little interesting to me is just the two quick thoughts. One, this is tighter than a lot of special elections have been. As far as it's so. I think that may get to my point that, yes, maybe it's unfair, the language. But on the other hand, my suspicion here is that there is some invocation of fairness going on here in that tighter vote. I mean, Democrats have been sort of running the table on these things, and to have that, not the ballot measures, but just, when voting happens, which I think leads me to believe that probably there is a little something else at play here beyond, raw partisanship in terms of that vote. But I think just one other point, if I could make quickly, and this does not affect Virginia so much just because of the direction, but I do think this has the potential, like Texas in particular, to blow up in Republicans' faces just because of the nature of how gerrymandering works. You are trading essentially more districts for smaller advantages in those districts. And so I'm not sure when Trump kicked this off, if they totally thought this through. We've seen this before, that, these moments where you kind of try to increase the number of seats that way are pretty sensitive to wave elections. And so, it's entirely possible that, again, Virginia, that's not the issue. Now it could in a Republican wave. I mean, this could blow up in because, we have elections in the future too. This Virginia map could blow up on Democrats in a red wave kind of year. So, I'm also not sure that always these things get thought through to the degree that they probably should.
And
That
I think
is an excellent point.
that's an issue that some legislators in Florida are concerned about right now, why they're not necessarily all eager to do that, because all of a sudden what looked like decent margins, now you start looking at the polls, and a lot of those voters who were who went for Trump in 2024 are leaving him, and I think there's some real concern. But for me, the last point I'll make on this is that there was a big spending differential here, roughly 3-1 for the pro-gerrymander to anti-gerrymandering folks, and that Trump-aligned MAGA Incorporated PAC did not really jump in a significant way, even though it has over $300 million in the bank. And a lot of folks on the right, I think, are looking at this as a missed opportunity, a strategic miscalculation, though I've heard some people say, well, maybe Donald Trump didn't want to nationalize a race in a state he lost. But honestly, I don't buy that because I don't think Donald Trump thought he lost any states, maybe aside from Massachusetts, but...
There's a lot of Trump supporters in Massachusetts.
Well, he said he won California, right? So who knows? But I just think this was a strategic miscalculation, and they could have perhaps prevented a likely Democratic pickup of maybe 4 or 5 seats here if they had just put a little more money and time into it. But clearly they didn't do it.
That's fair. Well, gentlemen, it's been a lot of fun having a 3-person show with you. We don't get to do that so often. But that comes to the end of our time for the Politics Guys. But we got more coming up. We're not done. We've got a midweek show for supporters, and Justin and I, as I hope you guys know, have been going through political ideologies, and we're taking on feminism this week, and so I'd love for you to join that. But for you to join us in that, you've got to become a supporter of the show. It just takes a couple of minutes. All you have to do is head down to the show notes and click on the support link there, or if you're a little more old school, you can always head to politicsguys.com/support. Now, there's all different kinds of levels of plans. I'd love for you to take a look at that, and as Mike had mentioned at the beginning of the show, if you do it on a yearly basis, there's all kinds of savings to be had. So again, head down to the show notes, become a supporter today, and get all kinds of cool things like ad-free versions of this show and our supporters exclusive midweek show on our ongoing items, which include the Federalist Papers, and with myself and Justin, includes political ideologies, and this week, feminism. If you're not in the financial position to support the show at this time, you can always reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com, and we can get things set up. If you would, please subscribe, rate, and review this episode. We need your algorithms, and we would appreciate that. Also, sharing episodes with a little bit of commentary is a great way to help podcasts reach a wider audience. As always, I end by noting and shouting out to our just incredible executive producers, and they are Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. We'll be back next week. I hope you'll join us then.
Ass hat.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,